In May 1941, Britain was hanging on to the Atlantic like a lifeline. Those routes carried fuel, food, weapons, everything the island needed to survive. And into that ocean, Germany was ready to unleash a steel monster. Not a submarine, not a cruiser, a battleship. Its name was Bismarck. And when it put to sea, Britain knew this was no ordinary raid. This was a hunt. But no one yet knew who was hunting whom. Bismarck was not meant just to sail. It was meant to inspire fear. Over 2 football fields long, thousands of tons of armor, huge main gun turrets, guns that could throw shells for tens of kilometers. In German propaganda, it looked like proof Germany was a naval power again. But in reality, it was a gamble. A big ship is easy to spot. It is hard to hide. And if it is damaged far from home, it is almost impossible to save. But in spring 1941, Command decided to take the risk. The plan was called Operation Rainabung. The goal was simple and brutal. Break into the Atlantic, find the British convoys, and rip them apart. In May, Bismarck did not sail alone. Alongside it sailed the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Together, they were meant to slip north, then turn toward Iceland, and reach the Atlantic through the Denmark Strait. On paper, it looked perfect. At sea, it was a different story. The weather hid the ships, but it also hid the enemy. The British knew it. If Bismarck broke through, every convoy was at risk. So everyone started watching her. Aircraft, cruisers, radio men, and somewhere in that gray water, the first duel of eyes began. On May 23rd, British cruisers spotted the German ships. They were Suffolk and Norfolk. They could not just charge into battle, but they could do something more important. Pass the coordinates and stay close. Bismarck tried to shake them off. The cruisers hid in the fog. Radar kept them from losing the quarry. Now the hunt was real. 2 ships were sent to intercept. One was the new battleship Prince of Wales. The other was a legend. HMS Hood. For Britain, Hood was more than a ship. It was an imperial symbol. And on the morning of May 24th, that symbol was steaming straight toward Bismarck. The dawn was cold. Visibility was poor. The ships saw each other almost as shadows. The British opened fire. The Germans answered. At first, it looked like a typical clash of big ships. The range was enormous. Hitting the target was hard. Every correction mattered. 1 degree, a few seconds, and a ton of metal flies toward the target. Hood was coming on. Prince of Wales stayed close beside her. But the Germans knew exactly where to aim to. Every gun was trained on the British legend. Then came what no one wanted to imagine. A Bismarck shell struck Hood. The hit landed where the ship was most vulnerable. Below were the shell rooms. And in an instant, the British symbol exploded. Not slowly. Not after a long fight. Almost at once. Hood broke apart and sank within minutes. Only wreckage was left on the surface. Smoke. And a silence nobody believed. Of more than 1,400 men, only 3 survived. For Britain, it was more than a naval loss. It struck the Empire's self-confidence. And at that moment, Bismarck became the world's most hunted ship. At first glance, Bismarck had won. He had destroyed a legend. He had forced Prince of Wales out of the fight. But the victory was incomplete. British shells found their mark too. One of them damaged the fuel tanks. Now the battleship was losing fuel, and it could no longer keep raiding. Instead of hunting convoys, it had to think about repair. The course changed. The target was no longer the Atlantic. Now the target was France. And that gave the British their opening. After Hood was lost, this was no longer about calculations. It became a matter of honor. Churchill wanted one thing: find Bismarck and sink her. Ships moved out from every direction. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers. But the ocean is huge. And for hours, Bismarck vanished. For the British, that was the worst of it. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the ship that had already destroyed their pride was still moving. And if it reached a French port, history could have ended very differently. Sometimes a ship is decided not by a shell, not by a torpedo, but by a radio message. The commander of the German force sent a long transmission. Too long. Britain got another chance to work out where to look. At sea, the hunting lines shifted again. But knowing was not enough. They had to stop the battleship. Not just find her. Stop her. Carrier Ark Royal entered the game. On her deck were Swordfish torpedo bombers. They looked almost obsolete. Slow. Fragile. But they were the ones sent against the steel giant. The first attack almost became a disaster. The pilots hit the wrong target. They lived through the mistake. But time was running out. That evening, the planes took off again. Low over the water. Under anti-aircraft fire. Against a ship that seemed too big to stop. One torpedo hit. Not in the most dramatic spot. Right in the most important one. Bismarck's rudder jammed. The giant could no longer turn properly. It was still alive. It was still armed. But it was no longer free. That night, British destroyers stayed close. They attacked. They kept him busy. They gave Bismarck's crew no peace. They tried to fix the rudder on board. But sea, steel, and time were against them. The ship was heading where the captain did not want it to go. It was going only where the broken rudder allowed. France was still far away. British battleships were closing in. And by morning, the ocean would become a courtroom. On May 27th, the British found Bismarck. It was still enormous. Still dangerous. But now it could not choose the fight. The British battleships opened fire. Shells fell all around Bismarck. Then the hits started landing. One turret after another fell silent. Rangefinders were smashed. The bridge was reduced to ruins. The crew kept fighting. But this was no longer a duel of equals. This was a steel giant being finished off. Water flooded the compartments. Fires rose above the deck. The guns fell silent. And the ship that was meant to tear through the Atlantic was trapped in it. Debate over the final minutes still goes on. Some say British shells and torpedoes finished it. Others say the crew may have opened the sea cocks to deny the ship to the enemy. But for history, something else matters more. Bismarck went under. More than 2,000 men went with her. Few survived. The hunt was over. But the legend was only beginning. The Bismarck became a legend not because it fought for long. Its sortie was short. Almost too short for such a giant. But in those days, everything fit inside it. Pride. Mistake. Chance. Technology. And the end of an era. Because Bismarck was built as the king of old naval warfare. But it died in a world that was already changing. Heavy guns could still destroy ships. But a small plane with a torpedo could decide a giant's fate. And that is the whole meaning of this story. Steel can be thick. Guns can be enormous. A name can sound like a threat. But at sea, one damaged rudder can beat all that armor. Bismarck went to sea as a hunter. And came back in history as prey, hunted by an empire. But the bigger the ship, the deadlier the mistake. The next minutes would haunt Britain for decades. The winner of the battle was already losing control of its fate. These odd hunters looked less like the future of war and more like the past. By the morning of May 27th, this was no longer a chase. It was an execution.